Racist police officers raid old black woman's home, then realize she's their police chief's grandmother. Hey everyone. Before we jump into today's emotional and eye-opening story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. We're always bringing you real, powerful stories that remind us just how important it is to stand up and protect the ones we love. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know what country you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories reach and connect us all across the world. Now, let's get into this. There are moments in life that expose the cracks in the systems we trust. They creep up on us, sometimes disguised as routine events, and other times as grave mistakes. Today's story is one of those moments, a moment when two men, cloaked in authority, entered a quiet home in a peaceful neighborhood. They were just doing their job, or so they thought, but what followed was far more than a search for justice. It became a reminder of the prejudice that still festers beneath the surface. Our story begins on a cool morning, in a small suburban town, in the home of an elderly black woman named Edith Johnson. The raid that unfolded there would leave the officers involved shaken, because Mrs. Johnson was no ordinary citizen. Picture this. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the sleepy neighborhood where Edith Johnson lived. At 78 years old, Mrs. Johnson had been a part of this community for over 5 decades. Her house stood at the corner of the block, a modest, yet well-kept home, filled with a lifetime of memories. Pictures of her late husband, her children, and grandchildren hung proudly on the walls. Mrs. Johnson had been a school teacher before she retired. Now, her days were spent tending to her garden, visiting her church, and baking sweet potato pies for the neighbors. To those around her, she was a beloved figure, a source of wisdom and kindness. But to the officers who would storm into her home that morning, she was simply a target. On the other side of town, 2 police officers were getting ready for what they thought would be a standard raid. Officers Mark Richards and John Blake, both white, both veterans of the police force. They were responding to a tip, though the source of that tip was shaky at best. No matter, they were on a mission. They'd been told there was suspicious activity coming from a house in a quiet neighborhood. Drugs, maybe? Stolen goods? Something illegal, surely. They were eager to get the job done, as if busting down a door and uncovering something sinister might add another notch to their belts. And so, with lights flashing and sirens off, they arrived in Mrs. Johnson's driveway. The peaceful morning was about to be shattered. Richards and Blake stepped out of their cruiser, hard expressions on their faces. They didn't care to ask questions. They didn't care to verify their information. All they saw was a house they believed was connected to crime, and a target inside it they were sure fit their assumptions. Inside her home, Mrs. Johnson was completely unaware of the storm brewing outside her front door. She was making tea, humming softly to herself as the kettle began to whistle. Her house, with its cozy living room and family photographs, seemed worlds away from the aggressive law enforcement mission about to descend upon it. Suddenly, a loud, forceful knock on her front door broke through the calm. It was the kind of knock that sends shivers down your spine. "Police, open up!" came the voice from outside. Mrs. Johnson, startled, slowly made her way to the door, leaning heavily on her cane. She wasn't sure what was going on, but she knew something was wrong. As she approached, her hands trembled, but she managed to speak out. "Who is it? What do you want?" she called, her voice shaky. Outside, officers Richards and Blake were growing impatient. They pounded on the door again, harder this time. "Police, open this door now, or we're coming in," Richards shouted, his voice full of authority, but with an edge of irritation. Mrs. Johnson, confused and frightened, unlocked the door and cracked it open, only to be met with the sight of 2 uniformed men pushing past her without a second thought. They didn't wait for an invitation. They didn't explain their presence. They just barged in. "Step aside, ma'am. We have a warrant." Blake's words were cold, dismissive, as though this elderly woman standing there in her slippers was nothing more than an obstacle. Imagine being in her shoes. This was her home, her sanctuary, filled with memories of the family she had raised, of her late husband's laughter, of her grandson's first steps. And now, these 2 officers were tearing it apart. They rifled through her drawers, flipped over cushions, upended her furniture, looking for something, anything, to justify their intrusion. But there was nothing to find. Mrs. Johnson stood there, heart racing, her voice trembling as she tried to make sense of it all. "Please," she pleaded, "there must be some mistake. I'm just an old woman. I haven't done anything wrong." But the officers barely listened. They continued their search, convinced that they would uncover something to validate their assumptions. But then, something made them pause. Richards had opened a drawer, rifling through old papers, when he came across something unexpected. A photo. An old photograph of Mrs. Johnson, smiling with her arm around a man in a police uniform, a man they both recognized. It was their boss, Chief Marcus Davis. The realization hit them like a ton of bricks. They exchanged panicked glances, and for the first time, doubt crept into their faces. Suddenly, the arrogance drained from their postures. Officer Blake, his face pale, muttered under his breath, "Wait, is that Chief Davis?" Mrs. Johnson, who had been watching them tear through her home, now stepped forward, her voice calm and steady. "Yes," she said, "that's my grandson, Marcus Davis. He's the police chief here." The weight of her words settled in the room, heavier than the silence that followed. The two officers, visibly rattled, began stammering apologies. They were sorry, they said. They didn't know, they said. But the truth was, they didn't care to know. They had made their assumptions the moment they saw her. A black woman living alone in a suburban neighborhood. They didn't bother to ask questions or consider who she might be. To them, she was just another target. But now they had to face the consequences of their actions. As they fumbled to explain themselves, Mrs. Johnson didn't let them off the hook so easily. "You didn't care to know," she said, her voice still calm but filled with quiet strength. "You saw me and you thought the worst. That's the problem." And then the front door opened again. This time, it wasn't the officers pushing their way in. It was Chief Marcus Davis himself. His face was a mask of fury as he took in the scene. His grandmother's home torn apart, his officers standing there pale and shaken, and Mrs. Johnson sitting calmly amidst the chaos. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He could see it. "What the hell is going on here?" Chief Davis demanded, his voice low but simmering with anger. Richards and Blake tried to explain. They stammered, stumbled over their words. They didn't know she was his grandmother. They were just following protocol. It was all a mistake. But Chief Davis wasn't interested in their excuses. "And that's supposed to make it better?" he snapped, his voice rising. "You didn't know she was my grandmother, so you thought it was okay to treat her like this?" The silence that followed was deafening. And so in that quiet suburban house, a reckoning had taken place. Not just for the two officers, but for the department they served and for the system they represented. Because what happened that morning wasn't just a mistake. It was the product of a system that still too often relies on assumptions, on prejudice, on the belief that some people, because of the color of their skin, don't deserve the same respect, the same dignity as others. But this time they made a mistake they couldn't ignore. This time, the woman they wronged wasn't just a nameless face. She was the grandmother of the man who held their futures in his hands.